Hey everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining this nutrition seminar. Our topic today is anti-inflammatory foods and herbs, and my name is Sarah Bratton, and I'm super excited to dive into this topic with everyone. It's such an important issue that we deal with, that many of us deal with on a regular basis, and there are some simple steps and things that we can do to both understand why inflammation is happening in our body and what we can do to combat the negative effects of inflammation in our body. So let's dive right in. So first, let's take a look at why we are inflamed. It's really important to note that inflammation is the body's normal response to injury or infection. It is a natural immune response that the body exhibits when it is under attack in some way. And so there's two different kinds of inflammation. They are acute and chronic. And so acute inflammation is what happens immediately when you experience injury or in the first stages of an infection. So a great example of an acute inflammatory response is something that happened to me this past weekend. I was lifting a large heavy box up over my head to push it onto a shelf, lost my balance, lost my grip on the box, and it fell and landed on my neck and shoulder. And immediately, my body kicked into an inflammatory response. It swelled up, it became very tender, it became very hot. And there were three different things biologically that happened with that inflammatory response. The first is that the blood flow to that specific area is increased. And that increase in blood and other fluids is why we get both the redness and the swelling in an acute inflammatory response. The next thing that happens is the capillary walls open. And thirdly, the white blood cells of the body, which many of you probably know are the body's natural fighters, they rush to the scene of the crime to deal with that inflammatory reaction and begin to deal with the damage and begin to repair. So acute inflammation is very necessary, of course, for dealing with repairing those things and protecting our body from that damage. There's another type of inflammation that has become so common in our world today, and that is that of chronic inflammation. So unlike acute, which is dealing with a kind of a one-time incident or an infection, something like that, a chronic inflammatory condition is something that there's ongoing inflammation in the body over a very long period of time. And this is a huge deal in our culture today. In fact, 60% of American adults have at least one chronic inflammatory condition, and over 40% of American adults have two or more. And this has grown very rapidly in recent decades. And scientists and researchers really believe that this is contributed to environmental factors. And the reason that we know that is because it has grown so rapidly in a short period of time, and also because these types of chronic inflammatory conditions are much more common in Western cultures, such as the United States and Western Europe. And they're much more prevalent in these cultures than they are in like the Eastern world or developing countries. And so we know that there are environmental factors that are contributing to the development of higher levels of chronic inflammation in people today. So some of those environmental factors: ongoing exposure to toxins, chronic stress, and lifestyle factors such as excessive alcohol consumption, smoking, drug use, pharmaceutical use, things like that. So we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into those things. So some of the inflammatory conditions that we're talking about, of course, on the chronic level, are going to be things like joint pain. We have different types of back pain and different things that could be causing that ongoing, discs being inflamed or muscle tissue being inflamed. Different forms of arthritis. We've got migraines. Many people suffer today from chronic migraines or other types of headaches. Hormone dysfunction. Then we have all of the digestive forms of inflammation, such as irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, diverticulitis, celiac, and other food sensitivities, any types of food allergies or sensitivities are inflammatory conditions, as well as diabetes and other autoimmune diseases, heart disease. All of these things can be attributed to chronic inflammation in one or more parts of the body. And if you add all of these things up, these things are really altogether the leading cause of both disease and death in our culture today. So obviously inflammation is a very, very big concern for many people and things that we deal with on a daily basis. So obviously, there's this ongoing issue of toxicity in our environment, and you may know, but there have been thousands of new chemicals and toxins that are in our air supply, in our water supply, sprayed onto our food supply through pesticides, herbicides, all of those kinds of processing agents, as well as protective agents, and all the different cleaners and supplies we have in our home. All of these things attribute to a much, much higher toxicity level in our environment. And of course, we have government agencies that regulate these things and control how much of them is used in different products. But over time, there's been such a huge accumulation that even there's a study that's been done within the umbilical cords of newborn babies, there were over 200 toxins already present, that even before birth, babies were having to deal with those toxins that had been passed on from their mother. So from the very time that we're born, we're dealing with that toxic overload in our environment and in our system. And while we have cleansing organs such as our liver and our kidneys to really help the body rid itself of those toxins, there are just so many in the world today. So next, let's talk about stress, because stress is basically the biological equivalent of inflammation. The body interprets stress as inflammation, and it causes an inflammatory response. There are two main hormones that are called the stress hormones. Those are cortisol and adrenaline. And these are very necessary hormones because we need them for those moments and those times where we need that fight or flight response. We need that extra energy to kick in when we're going into an important meeting, when we're going into a big performance. Back in the day, the fight and flight response was very necessary if someone encountered a wild animal and they needed to run for their life or fight for their survival. And so these cortisol and adrenaline hormones are so necessary. But what's happened is, because of the culture that we live in and the level of stimulation that we live with, our bodies are overproducing these hormones and releasing so much stress into the body, because if you think about a survival type situation, the body's not super worried when it's in that fight or flight about all of the other mechanisms of health. It's only worried about the short-term survival. And so when we put our bodies in survival mode for long periods of time, what ends up happening is this increase of cortisol and adrenaline, and that leads to this ongoing chronic inflammation in the body. So chronic stress is linked to numerous diseases and health conditions. There are tons of studies that you can see where they've linked it to heart disease, different kinds of autoimmune disease. Stress equals inflammation. And so as much as we can reduce the stress load on our bodies, it's really going to help us to be able to lower those inflammation levels. Managing stress is a major key to healthy aging and to really not developing some of those chronic inflammatory conditions that we just talked about. And finally, sugar. This is something that has changed so drastically in recent years that sugar consumption is at an all-time high. The average American consumes 126.4 grams of added sugar daily. This is substantially more than any other country in the world, substantially more. And this is a very difficult thing for the body to process in such large amounts, especially when we look at the fact that not only are we getting sugar in the refined carbohydrates and the cookies and cakes and all those kinds of things, but it's also being put into our pasta sauces and our salad dressings and basically everything. Especially a couple decades ago when fat-free was the big craze, when they took the fat out of such things as dairy products and yogurts, those kinds of things, they added sugar in its place. And so it really increased the sugar consumption in our Western diet. And this is one of those things that also causes a great amount of inflammation in our bodies. So let's get on to the good news, because it can be really easy to go, wow, there's so many factors that cause chronic inflammation. We're dealing with this on a daily basis. But there are things that each one of us can do for our own health and the health of our families to really begin to make a difference and bring down those inflammation markers in our bodies. So the first thing, of course, which we're going to spend the majority of the rest of our time talking about today, is consuming a variety of anti-inflammatory foods and herbs. And so we'll get into a little bit more of what that looks like. But there's so much that we can do based on what we put in our mouths to really make a difference with the inflammatory factors. Another couple of things that I wanted to mention briefly, we won't spend a lot of time on, but filtering your water and drinking a lot of it, right? We really want to be flushing that toxicity out of our bodies. And so making sure that you have a clean source of water and then staying really well hydrated is just a baseline, really important thing that we all need to do. So get hydrated. Move your body. Okay, so we know that exercise obviously is very important for our health and for inflammation. I mentioned at the beginning that the inflammatory response is that a lot of blood and other fluids move to the site of the acute inflammation. Well, the lymphatic system in the body is a system that's very key to immune health, your lymph nodes, your lymph system, and it needs physical movement in our body to be able to work and operate properly. And so even if it's a brief, quick walk around the neighborhood, a quick home workout, moving your body is essential to releasing inflammatory response. And we could get into that a lot more, but just know that this is a huge thing that you can do to reduce the inflammation in your body. Get adequate rest and sleep. We talked about stress and really focusing on those things that are de-stressors. It's a major, major game changer. And coming into those rhythms where both mentally and physically we're allowing our bodies to rest and reboot really, really allows for our bodies to begin to heal from some of that chronic inflammation. Another great thing is taking like a salt bath, like soaking in Epsom salts or sea salts and allowing the body to release inflammation that way. Really, really important way to allow the body to rest and release that inflammation. And lowering stress levels, whether that's on an emotional, mental level, relationally, so important for helping bring down that inflammation response that our bodies deal with on a daily basis. So let's get into some anti-inflammatory foods and herbs. I wanted to break it down into the different types of nutrients. And so we're going to start off with carbs, because carbs are a very big buzzword. There's a lot going on in culture today where people are really advocating for a low carb diet, really reducing the amount of net carbs that we're intaking. And carbohydrates in general have gotten kind of the bad rap for contributing maybe to different kinds of disease, including overweight, obesity, and all the comorbidities that go along with that. But I wanted to put this slide up first to just show what anti-inflammatory carbs look like. And it is so crucial that we are getting carbohydrates because it's our body's #1 source of energy. And obviously the things that are listed here: leafy green vegetables, pumpkin, squash, celery, beets, broccoli, onions, leeks, fennel, lentils, berries, grapefruits, oranges. All of these things are some of the most highly nutritious foods that we can eat. And they also contain many properties, vitamins, minerals, and all those sorts of things that allow the body to release inflammation. And so it is really important to note that, you know, if we were to look at the nutrition facts of a serving size of broccoli, it contains 10 grams of carbohydrates. You know, something like beets is actually a very high carbohydrate vegetable at about 16 grams per serving. But the nutrition that's in there is so beneficial, as well as the fiber. And so those things, you know, I want to encourage you, this is going to be the bulk of what you're going to be eating. Like on any given meal, you know, about half of it is going to be these types of things, sometimes even more than half. And so we don't want to necessarily be restricting carbs when it comes to these types of things, vegetables, legumes. However, of course, there's a whole other category of carbs in bread products and sugars and all of those kinds of things that we do want to significantly reduce in order to bring down inflammation in the body. So here's just a list of some great anti-inflammatory carbs to add in to your daily routine. The next category is proteins, and proteins are essential for obviously muscle tissue, but also lean body mass, which includes things like our organ tissue. Organ tissue is made up of predominantly proteins. And so if we're dealing with injury, you know, maybe you had a surgery, maybe you're coming off of, you know, some things that have set your body back, you really need to make sure you're getting adequate sources of great quality protein so that your body can begin to repair that tissue, utilizing those amino acids that are the building blocks of the proteins. Now, when it comes to protein, you know, there's many schools of thought, and I believe in a clean meat diet. That there's many health benefits to that. People who choose not to eat meat, whether it's for health reasons or for you know, other types of ethical reasons, there are ways to get good quality sources of protein. It just takes a little bit more work to get enough lentils and beans and nuts and seeds and those kinds of things in order to get the adequate amounts of protein that we need in our diet. But the thing that I want to note about proteins is the benefits of grass-fed. And this is something that you know, is talked about often in health food circles. And what really are the health benefits of grass-fed when you're talking about grass-fed beef, pasture-raised chicken, as well as their byproducts? So pastured eggs and grass-fed dairy products, as well as wild-caught salmon, because their diet is going to contain so much more nutrition. And then when that is assimilated into the body of the animal, their meat or their byproduct is going to contain a much higher level of nutrition. So just to take one nutrient, for example, omega-3 fatty acids, which will be on the next slide when we talk about fats. But omega-3 fatty acids are something that we need a lot of, and for our brain health, all these kinds of different things. And it is, when you look at grass-fed versus grain-fed animals, the omega-3 levels are at, up to 5 times as much in grass-fed animals versus grain-fed. 5 times as much omega-3 fatty acids. Some of the other things that are seen in much higher levels in grass-fed animals, things like vitamin A, vitamin E, many minerals that are very lacking in our food supply, but come from the grass, and then the animal transfers those on in its protein and the dairy and eggs that come from the animal. So one other really important thing is something called glutathione, which is a molecule that's naturally produced in the liver, but many people's glutathione levels are very low. If people are dealing with any sort of autoimmune disease or any sort of a chronic infection type of a thing, their glutathione levels are likely very, very low. And this is one thing that is highly encouraged to either supplement or encourage the body to produce it at higher levels. And one of the greatest ways to do that is with grass-fed whey protein, actually, but also other grass-fed sources of protein help the body naturally boost its glutathione levels. So there are a lot of health benefits to grass-fed. Obviously, cost point is much higher, but if you think about how the animal was designed to eat, and for the majority of civilization, these animals did eat grass. They grazed, and the fish who are in the wild are eating those green algae, and that green, like whether it's spirulina, chlorella, those things that our body really needs the health benefits from the greens, we can get those as well through choosing grass-fed sources of protein. The third major macronutrient category is fats, and this is one that for many years was seen to be, fats make you fat, so avoid fats. Well, science has come back around and said, no, we need fats. We need them. They're essential for hormonal health, which could be a whole separate seminar because so many of our hormones are very out of balance in today's culture for many reasons. But healthy fats are so necessary for that hormonal health, for brain function, for cell membrane health, and also for helping that repair process and helping that inflammation come down. So the issue is so many of our fats that we deal with in canola oils, corn oils, those typical oils and fats that we see are very heavy in omega-6s, and it gets out of balance. So really increasing our omega-3 fatty acid intake through things like nuts, seeds, coconut products, avocado, fish and fish oils is an essential nutrient. Salmon is actually one of the most anti-inflammatory proteins that you can eat. So highly recommend that as both a source of protein and a source of this omega-3 fatty acids. So let's talk real quickly about herbs, spices, and other types of supplements. There are phenomenal herbs and spices that have just incredible health benefits. And the first that you're probably familiar with is turmeric. And turmeric is that yellow spice often used in Indian food. And it contains a compound called curcumin, which is one of the most powerful anti-inflammatory spices that we have, or compounds that we have available to us. It's pretty flavorless, but there's this thing called turmeric milk that you may be familiar with, or golden milk. It's quite easy to make your own because turmeric by itself is not very expensive, and you can put it in with some coconut milk that has those great omega-3 fatty acids and really helps your body absorb that turmeric, as well as some of these other spices. Coriander, such a phenomenal spice. It's one of my favorite ones to use in meat dishes as well as soups. Ginger, very highly anti-inflammatory. Burdock root supports the liver function and really helps the body to deal with inflammation. Devil's claw is another supplement to look into. And then these next two, trace minerals and adaptogenic herbs, these are larger categories that contain many things within them. Trace minerals are something that is highly lacking in our foods today because of the use of pesticides and herbicides over the years, that these trace minerals that used to be in our foods no longer exist in those foods in great quantity. And so there are supplemental ways that we can get those minerals, also using a very high quality salt that has a variety of rock minerals in it that can help with mineral content. And then if you look for something like ionic minerals, that is something that can help supplement that area that is so lacking. And then adaptogenic herbs. We talked about how stress is a major cause of inflammation, and stress is essentially the biological equivalent of inflammation in the body. There's a whole category of herbs called adaptogenic herbs that are making their way into the mainstream more and more because people are realizing the effects of stress on our body. And adaptogens grow in very harsh environments where they need to adapt to the stressors in the world. So they might grow up high in the mountains of Nepal or in the Sahara Desert. And there are these plants and herbs that have learned how to adapt and deal with the stresses of their environment. And when people consume them, they also help our bodies to adapt to the stresses in whether they're external stresses or internal from these chronic inflammatory conditions. So this is something I would highly recommend looking into, things like ashwagandha, astragalus, ginseng, many incredible things in this category that can help the body to level out those stress levels and begin to bring down the inflammatory chronic responses that we're dealing with on a daily basis. So the bottom line is choosing quality over quantity, and noting that in each of these different categories, we need carbohydrates in our body. We need proteins. We need fats. We need micronutrients in greater degree than we're getting them. And so getting a higher quality in each of these categories is so essential. And it's also more satisfying. And so foods with a higher net nutrient density are going to not only be more satisfying on that deep level, but they're also going to provide our bodies with the fuel to eliminate inflammatory toxins. And we're being exposed to so many things today, whether it's environmental toxins or whether it's these super bugs and the co-infection that goes along with getting like a flu bug or a bad cold or something like that, and that ongoing inflammation that happens within the body. It's so important to give our bodies the fuel to be able to fight really well and begin to eliminate some of those inflammatory toxins from the body. So let's talk really quickly about the process of making the shift. It can be really difficult to convert over to an anti-inflammatory way of eating. And one of the reasons is many of the things that we eat in our ongoing diet are very addictive. And one of those being sugar, right? Sugar is one of the most highly addictive food substances that we can put in our bodies. And so it's very difficult to cut that out because in my own experience, you will go through sugar withdrawals. And this is something that, may cause headaches or achiness or lots of cravings. And so rather than kind of looking at eliminating those things one at a time, my best recommendation is to go cold turkey for 3 days, which is cutting out all sugars, including fruits, including natural sweeteners, including any sort of sugar replacement substitute. Many of those have a lot of chemicals in them anyway, artificial sweeteners, all of that, cut it out. As well as grains, because most grains, especially when they're highly refined, convert directly to glucose in the body. And so essentially, if you eat white bread, white rice, those kinds of things, they are immediately going to convert to a sugar in the body. As well as dairy and alcohol. All these things have very high levels of sugar content in them naturally. And while some of these things we're going to add back in later on, especially for that initial process, cutting some of those things out is going to give you the best possible success. So for those 3 days, you're going to be eating a lot of vegetables, drinking some herbal teas and some lean, healthy sources of proteins and fats. Lean proteins and healthy fats. So then on day 4, and for those next few days, add back in a serving of full fat grass-fed dairy per day. So maybe that's your butter or your full fat, sugar, non-sugared yogurt or something like that to begin to ease some of those things back in. And then eventually we're going to add back in a serving of fruit per day, especially things like berries, apples, and citrus fruits like grapefruits and oranges. high levels of anti-inflammatory micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. And so these are the best source for kind of getting a healthy sweet treat. And it does take a while for your body to start to see, experience those differences, but it's worth sticking it out and seeing the health benefits that come from it. So I have a couple of sample recipes to share with you, and these are highly stocked with anti-inflammatory foods and ingredients. And so this first one is a lentil soup, and it contains some greens. They call them winter greens, such as kale, Swiss chard, collard greens, or spinach. Spinach does kind of boil down very quickly, and so if you are going to add spinach, I would suggest adding it quite a bit later in the cooking process. But as we look down the list, things like onions and those herbs, the lentils themselves, very highly anti-inflammatory foods, and this is such a tasty soup. I love it for a cold winter evening to just have that very warm. The lentils have a high amount of protein in them, so it's also very satisfying. Another great recipe is this sweet potato and chickpea curry. If you're in that initial stage of sugar elimination, I would wait on the sweet potatoes, but it's something to add back in maybe a week into the process as you're reintroducing some of those things. Sweet potato has a lot of great nutrients in it, but it is fairly starchy and it does have a fair amount of natural sugars. And so for that initial, as you're kind of getting past those sugar cravings and resetting your body's insulin response, eliminating things like sweet potatoes, and things like those really starchy root vegetables can help get you through that initial, and then start to add those things back in. Oh, and I wanted to mention earlier on about the nightshade family, because this is something that I sometimes get questions about. Some people, if they are in an or if they have something like an autoimmune or ongoing inflammation of their body, some people are sensitive to the nightshade family. Nightshade family is tomatoes, potatoes, bell peppers, eggplants, and those are kind of the main foods that fall in that category. And it's a case-by-case basis, and it's a specific, inflammatory food sensitivity that some people have to those foods in the nightshade family. So if you are curious and you think you might be sensitive to those, you can cut those out as well and see, when you begin to add them back in, if you have an inflammatory response to that, or you can get allergy tested to see if you're sensitive to the nightshade family. It's a small percentage of people, and it tends to be when you already have a lot of inflammation going on in your body. And that's something to note, that as you cleanse out some of those toxins and get your body to a better place in its inflammation level, you may be able to even add some of those things back in, because oftentimes our bodies are on high alert if we're dealing with one or more chronic inflammatory conditions. And when we begin to calm some of those things down through these anti-inflammatory foods and herbs and all of those things, we may be able to introduce back in some things like the nightshade family, or those dairy products and things like that. So here are a few other meal ideas. Obviously, I mentioned salmon being one of the best protein sources for reducing inflammation. Pan-seared salmon on a bed of sauteed greens, a burrito bowl with grass-fed beef. I would recommend something like cauliflower rice for the base of that, as well as some beans. Zucchini noodle soup, love making that in the wintertime. A butternut squash bowl. Squash and pumpkin are some of those carbohydrates that are very, very anti-inflammatory, have a lot of great nutrients in them that nourish the body. A spinach salad with walnuts and berries. It's kind of a treat because those things start to taste so sweet. And for dressing, I would recommend some lemon juice and some olive oil or grapeseed oil and just make a real simple salad dressing with that, and maybe some berries, blended up and makes a nice vinaigrette type of a dressing. Roasted root vegetables with goat cheese and herbs. And some of it is planning ahead, right? Meal planning, maybe taking a day, a weekend to plan out several meals in advance so that when the day comes, we're not grabbing whatever is convenient, but rather we're set up for success and we have healthy foods and meals ready to support our process through including these anti-inflammatory foods. So as we wrap up, I just want to wish you all of the best on your journey to better health. It is a daily process. And when I think about sometimes the time frame, we get maybe bogged down with the fact that it's a journey and it takes time to rid the body of chronic inflammation, but it is worth it. And know that you are setting yourself up with habits that are going to bless you for the rest of your life, as well as your family. If you have kids or involved in your grandkids' lives, that you can pass on those healthy habits to the future generations and set them up for a life of health and wellness and vitality. So best wishes to each of you. Thank you again for joining and being a part, and we will see you next time.